I think that Ed Hardy's publications in the late 80s or mid to late 80s, that kind of put the idea out there with these young art school kids and essentially started the new school of tattooing.
Check this out.
In my mind, there's an order to it. Kind of going in terms of like Filip Leu, who was more like the European influence, and then Eddy Deutsche, who coincidentally worked with Ed for a period of time, and then Marcus Pacheco, Cain, Aitchison, and Paul Booth. Starting around like 88, 89, publications kind of took notice to their work because it was so different. And in my mind was kind of like the catalyst. You know, it sparked off the 90s, and that was the formation of what New School was. You know. Eddy Deutsche is a tattooer that I became aware of through Ed Hardy's Tattoo Times. He worked with him at the time, but I gather that he's from Detroit originally. He's still working to this day, still killing it. He's doing amazing tattoos. Basically, it seems like he was a huge influence on all of my favorite tattooers, you know. Subsequently, I became aware of him after I became aware of these other guys, you know. When I met Timothy Hoyer for the first time, he would always say, like, Eddie always says this or Eddie always says that, you know, and it was always be like this reverence to Eddie, you know. Eddie was kind of like who he kind of leaned on to, like, who did it right, who he did it the way he wanted to, you know. He has like a huge impact on, I'm sure through working with Ed, he even influenced Ed, you know. I think Ed would even say that, you know. But he did crazy tattoos, man, like really cool. He was mixing all different styles. He was the first person I ever saw that did a graffiti tattoo. Biomech mixed with like rat finks and onis from, you know, Japanese style stuff with finger waves on surfing, and you know what I mean. He was just kind of like throwing the book at everything, you know. It was just mixing. There was nothing off limits, you know. Through him, a majority of like the San Francisco tattooers kind of like migrated out that way. It seems that way. Most notably, Marcus Pacheco and Cain. They opened a studio called Primal Urge. I forget the year, but it was the early 90s. That tattoo shop to me was like, when I was a kid, was like they had it going on. It was like everything cool was coming out of Primal Urge. Marcus was doing very experimental tattoos with like figures and combining art forms that like cubism and things that people just had never seen before. It was just weird, you know. It was like unusual. And Aaron was doing tattoos that were very heavily influenced by H.R. Giger, biomechanical stuff, using like abstract forms that looked like an exoskeleton on someone's body. You know, it was like really out there, really interesting stuff, you know. And they were like a magnet for talent, you know. Timothy Hoyer eventually went there, Scott Sylvia, Jeff Whitehead, Jeff Rasher. So many tattooers kind of like probably wouldn't be who they were today if it wasn't for that place, you know. Paul Booth was kind of like an outlier in the scene. He had like a completely different take on things. It was less like, people were kind of like gravitating towards like spacey, sort of like sci-fi driven stuff. And color, they were going towards color. Paul was kind of the opposite. He was doing more like black and gray, combining the things that the tattooers in LA and in the Latin cultures were doing, and just kind of elevating it into this like macabre kind of imagery, you know, developing into like, he had something going on for a while that nobody was doing for quite a while. Aitchison from Chicago, he was kind of like the most accessible tattooer to me because he traveled quite a bit, and he was probably the first of those tattooers that I met in person. And Guy was always very open with dialogue concerning like technical side of tattooing and stuff, so it made him like more approachable to me. Meeting my idol when I was a kid, you know, so I really spent a lot of time watching him tattoo and seeing how he tattooed. He was kind of like an elaboration on the Aaron Cain style. You know, he took elements of what Eddy Deutsche was doing and Aaron was doing and kind of like jumbled them all together into this like psychedelic mix of abstract texture and light and shadow and all these sorts of things. You know, he still crushes tattoos. Timothy Hoyer, he's had an on and off relationship with New York for quite some time. Incredible tattooer, incredible painter. He has a direct connection to our own Chris O'Donnell and the influence that I'm sure Chris would attest to, the influence that both Eddy and Timothy had on him. You know, I think when I was a kid, it was they were described as the new school. I think when you hear new school tattooing these days, you think instantly of cartoons and like some anime looking stuff. But at the time, it was basically like a new school. It was a new school of thought. It was like something they were breaking away from tradition and doing everything different. You know, I don't think it was anything that they wanted to be called or anything, but it seemed to be that's the way like publications at the time were like labeling them. You know, as like a different way of doing things. You know, it definitely got me a little twisted. I was like, holy shit, this is what they're doing now. It kind of woke me up a little bit. You know, because it wasn't like the thing that your grandpa was doing down the street. It was completely fresh, you know, stuff that you wished that you could have done before, you know. It's like, oh, if I could do anything. It was a breath of fresh air at the time. I like that attitude in the 90s. It was a lot of, or at least in my own thoughts, being completely unique and not repeating myself like ever again, you know. That tattoo is never going to be, nobody's ever going to have that, you know. That's yours, you know. I like that idea a lot. There's a lot of apprentices that stem out from the Horitoshi family. They have a very wide network of people throughout Europe.
They roll deep.
They roll deep for sure. They do. And you know what? All the apprentices are amazing. Like that family lineage is strong as hell, and everyone's like contributing in their own way, like a really amazing stuff. So, Hori Zakura is like, man, like jaw dropper tattooer, you know.